Everyone ready? Thank you for coming. The closing days of COP, right? As we're going to save the world and come up with these really innovative solutions to the problems facing us. I'm very pleased that you came to this event. The need for equity, inclusion, diversity, and most important of all, financial support for the global south in scientific research. And the reason for this event is that our work with countries has identified a very important gap. And the gap is that scientific funding, well, it's either not there, or it's not equitable, or it's very difficult to acquire. The funding mechanisms that do exist, either through development banks, through the GEF, the Global Environment Fund, through the Green Climate Fund, very often are very onerous and time consuming and very difficult. I used to evaluate the scientific projects for the GEF in scientific and technical collaboration in the CBD. Yeah, I mean, they were that thick, right? It was a nightmare trying to go through those things. And the idea is for us to create a fund, a flexible fund that is aimed at science for scientists. Now, this already exists through the multilateral process. This is not an NGO-driven fund. This would go through the parties, through the multilateral process, but have the same type of peer review and selection that very often we find in the scientific world, whether it's research institutions or universities. And the multilateral organization that uses this model exists in the Americas. It's called the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. And it uses a very flexible funding mechanism to be able to support the types of scientific projects through universities, individual scientists and so on, but with the priorities identified by parties, by governments. Right? With this very brief introduction, and I'll be speaking about this more, I'd like to introduce our panel. First of all, two friends. Edwin I've known for many years. Edwin Castellanos, an IPCC author, a renowned scientist, works very much in Central America. He's now the science director of the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. And before I start, maybe you could say a few words about yourself, Edwin.
Thank you, Marcos, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. Very glad to be here in this panel. Like you mentioned, I am the science director for this intergovernmental organization called Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. This organization was created by the governments, by the states of the continent of America over 30 years ago to promote research among the different countries in the continent. The organization is now based in Uruguay, but I got to stay at my home country, Guatemala, so I am working remotely from Guatemala. I will leave it at that, just for an introduction. Thank you.
And maybe pass it to my colleague, Josh.
Hi everyone, my name is Joshua Ampunsem. I'm the founder for Green Africa Youth Organization, which is an organization that works with young people and youth, a very broad range of group. So it includes young researchers and students who are yet to define what career they want to pursue, and their research plays a very big role and the resources available to do that. So really happy to have a very curated conversation specifically to talk about research capacities also in Africa, but also broadly in the global south. Thanks, Marcos.
We have another speaker coming, Natalie Flores. I think she's lost. It's probably in the green zone somewhere without a compass, but she'll be here in a few minutes. And she is the focal point of the II, and I think Director for Climate Services, if I'm not mistaken, for the Dominican Republic. She's a party. And we felt it was very important to have a government represented in this talk, because you'll have me from SilverLining, an NGO, and Joshua. We have Edwin, who represents an IGO, an intergovernmental organization, and perhaps a government to be able to speak about these themes. Very briefly, to reiterate, the work that we've done in SilverLining has identified a gap in scientific funding, right? It's scientists in the global south let me backtrack. The global south is not a homogeneous globe with one voice, one view, and one articulation of a problem. It is a myriad of different voices, different levels of capacity, different views, and different approaches. And this voice right now does not have an equitable participation in many topics that are being held here at COP28. In solar radiation modification, for example, most of the research, the great majority of the research is from the global north. If you look at the number of papers published, I think it's the United States, United Kingdom, perhaps China, and so on, down to the very bottom to Brazil and South Africa. Most of the research is also funded by the global north. And this creates an inequity in the way we are approaching the problem. Now, I'm not giving a view of whether we should do large-scale deployment or not. I'm giving the view that public policy, the development of public policy, has to be based on scientific information. And only then can governments decide, through a multilateral process, whether large-scale deployment is a solution to a very targeted and well-defined problem, buying us a little bit of time until the steps that are necessary can be taken. This articulation has to be equitable. You cannot exclude the great majority of the world from articulating their views, their needs, and their voices in this dialogue, particularly since large-scale deployment will be global if a decision is taken through a multilateral instrument to do so. Again, we are not advocating yes or no. We're advocating science in very well-defined, targeted, turbocharged science to understand the problem. We believe that such a fund should also be a party-driven process through a multilateral process. We think a natural home for it, and this is an opinion of SilverLining, that it should be through the World Climate Research Program of the World Meteorological Organization. The WMO is a specialized agency, and as you know, specialized agencies have a lot of autonomy and power through the UN system, and it is a UN body. It has this program, the WCRP, composed of governments and scientists, which has done some incredible work and is very highly regarded. And it has the capacity to structure our large-scale fund using the mechanisms that I'll ask Edwin to describe of the III, where the money and the funds and the support go directly to scientists, the scientific community, goes directly to universities, bypassing the bureaucratic steps of, say, a JEF funding PIF or a green climate fund. Again, a multilateral process responding to the needs of the parties, but science-focused, where the funds can go in a very timely way using the mechanisms possibly used in an academic sector. Because the argument is policy decisions have to be backed by science. In a way, this is the precautionary principle, right? You do not want to make a decision based on assumptions. It's dangerous. In systems, you don't do that. The other concern that I have is that environmental governance is fragmented. If you look at SRM, the CBD of all places has decisions, and the three objectives of the CBD are what? A sustainable use, conservation, and excess and benefit sharing of genetic resources. It's as if the CBD is passing decisions on nuclear reactors, because what doesn't have an impact on biodiversity? Then we see decisions through either perhaps will be taken in UNEA, the United Nations Environment Assembly of UNEP, right? Decisions perhaps through the WMO. UNESCO is now publishing papers. So there's this fragmentation of governance, which leads to fragmentation of science. So you all of a sudden, you could have different scientific projects running after different funds, duplicating work, not cooperating, and perhaps not even sharing the data that's generated for the decision in public policy. What this fund hopes to do is offer some coherence to the situation. Right? And again, there is a mechanism that exists that does that. It's called the Belmont Forum, where a number of different funding mechanisms decide on a project. The project goes through multiple stages of design and input from civil society, from governments, and so on. And then they apply the funds to the elements of the projects they think is most appropriate. So if the French want to fund the French, they do so, but they could also fund Brazilians if a decision is taken. This fund would take these existing mechanisms to try to be able, again, to give coherence to this problem, to provide the information that's necessary for effective policy development, and allow an equitable, strong participation by the Global South. So with these words, I'll stop, and I'd like to introduce my colleague with whom I've worked many years, Natalie Flores, a government representative from the Dominican Republic. She's also in the Social Policy Advisory Committee of the IEI, I believe. Are you still a member? Yes, that's the body, the science. It's a little bit like a substa to the IEI. And I believe you're a director of climate services at the Environment Ministry of the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, I was. So now I serve as an advisor for the government of the Dominican Republic to serve to the convention as vice chair of the Science and Technology subsidiary body. So I'm the vice chair of SABSTA, appointed by the seat of the Small Island Developing States. I was climate change director for 3 years, and that's why I was national focal point for the IAI. And now I help IAI, right, as part of the Science and Policy Committee as an alternate member. So very happy to be here, and thank you for the introduction.
Thank you, Natalie. And just a few words about myself. I'd introduce myself. My name is Marcus Regis da Silva. I'm Brazilian. I am the former director of the IEI. Well, that's how I know Edwin, and we work together. I was also with the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization, and before that with UNEP in the conventions. So I've always had my feet in both worlds. So I'll start with civil society, right? Josh, you're a young person. We always talk about youth and the role of youth and why it's important. But I find that when I watched the COP, I watched the CBD, and when I was at UNEP, having effective participation of youth, especially in the development of this fund, is incredibly difficult. And while we can give lip service that, yes, indeed, we need participation of the youth, they have to be active, very often your voice is not there. What do you see as a solution to that, if you agree with this perception?
Thanks, Marcos. I partly agree. The part I agree is what I'll tackle. I think that, it's been 28 years of this conversation, and young people and other minority groups or underrepresented groups have been calling for better participation. And the reason is that several factors. That the process is designed to respond to parties. We recognize the role of civil society, but at the same time, it is limited because it's a negotiation is for parties, and civil society groups have a chance to observe this process. So that has its own limitation to that. But even more to that, I think for groups like young people, there has been lack of support in investing in the capacity to effectively be able to contribute. And now we've come to a point where a lot of the details is in the fine lines of the text, right? So it's a lot of conversation, a lot of arguments that are conversations that happen in the hallways, in the negotiation room. But at the end of the day, you have a text in front of you, and that text is the text. So if young people are not empowered enough to be able to read that text and be able to make the argument and have their input reflected in that text, it is very limiting in terms of our impact and our participation. So I think that is one of the first things I would say. The second part is that a lot of government officials or party members who are contributing to this conversation have come from a background of either very strong academic or technical or even practical capacity within the field in which they are negotiating. So whether it's adaptation or resilience or finance, they have worked many years in this field and they are coming with that experience. So when you open the space and you have an inclusive process that allow young people to participate, but you've not empowered them to know the details of this conversation, it's like if I would take you to my village in Ghana and put you in a middle seat of a traditional conversation about our culture. First of all, you are new to the culture. Your input will probably be listening, but hardly would you be able to make an input that is very valuable to that conversation. So many often we see increasing number of different underrepresented age groups showing up at COP, but the increase in number doesn't necessarily close the gap in terms of equity and inclusion. It's rather what are the resources we are putting in place to empower them before they actually come and they're able to contribute effectively. And that is where I think research plays a very significant role. So young people at the in universities, whether it's undergraduate or postgraduate or higher education, all of them are still at a space where they are thinking and asking themselves, what do I want to do with my life? Right? And most of them will see that the research they will do, whether they are thesis or dissertation, is always the first step to get an exposure to the field they want to work in. And in the global south, as you said, it's not generic that we all have the same conditions. If I look at Africa and I look at African universities and young people, whether it's higher education or first degree, a lot of the research they are doing, they have to finance it themselves. So if you come from a home that do not have that resource to finance it yourself, you end up doing a research that typically doesn't contribute much to solving real problems that you really are interested in. But you do not have the finance to be able to do that. You need access to a laboratory that is well equipped. And in many countries, you might probably have one laboratory that is in the capital that have those resources. And it will take a lot of transport to go back to that city, leave your samples there, have to do a lot of follow-ups, go collect it back. You don't have resource to do that. So you end up doing something that other students have done before, and you have the roadmap to it, and you do that. So this is an incredible human capital that, if I look at the African continent, the youngest continent, for instance, this is an incredible human capital that we have. That we have a lot of young people that we can actually support to take interest in leading research that is super critical in defining our resilience and how we are going to adapt or front or face near-term climate risk. But the resources are not there to support such early career researchers. And there is a research that came up recently that showed that out of about 800 students that were interviewed, almost 85% of them want to travel outside of the region to go to higher education. And out of that, already there's already like 20% drop of those who want to still pursue research because they do not have confidence in the research that they do, because development agencies and those who develop climate programs do not value their research because the tools and equipment are not there. So this is the challenge we face, and a good solution will be a fund that is not just tackling this issue, but a fund that is very accessible. Accessibility is very important because you cannot put a young researcher in a comparative place to a very experienced researcher who have done probably a bit of work abroad, come back to their home country. If they do an application to such a fund, the likelihood that they get selected to get the money is very higher than someone who have had all their studies at home, does not have too many publications to their name. They have a very less chance of being selected. And publications, again, are expensive. Gaio now runs a program where we support young researchers to publish their work. And sometimes the fees you pay to publish in a good journal can go as high as $3,000, $5,000. And even professors struggle to get that money, not to talk of a young person who is not pursuing their PhD. So that automatically knock a lot of us out of the game. And it's a structural inequality that is there. So a fund is important, but how to make that fund accessible to those who do not already have the credibility, who do not already have a name, who do not already have a huge profile, to access those funds will be very critical.
Yeah, to me, I mean, I've been talking about a lot about manifesting, and it's incredible that you just made that pitch because I just got out of a meeting in which we were talking exactly about that, and it resonates a lot to what the UNFCCC process is, right? Because you have the convention as a whole, you have the conference of the parties that are the ministers that represent all of us right here in this environment. Then you have the conference of the parties meeting as the Paris Agreement, which is the same ministers but or of another governing body. Then you have the Kyoto Protocol that it's already, passing from Kyoto to Paris. And then you have the subsidiary body for implementation and the subsidiary body for science and technology that I have the honor to be vice chair of. I was talking with a group of young negotiators that are actually helping developing countries and also developed countries to train young people to come to the negotiations and actually defend their future in a way that they look forward for the science behind what they are defending. So let's say it's not just advocating for to be an advocate, but matching science and policy. And I was explaining to them that in order to be part of a party-driven process, and this is very important, and I've been highlighting that since the moment I was selected for this role in June, and it's that if you want to be in the process, you either need to be an actual negotiator and be at the negotiations table, or make your voice clear enough to your representatives so they can put your priorities in the text that it's being negotiated over here. And being in this panel with both of you, and now that I met you, it's very inspiring for me because I have had very exceptional circumstances. Like my first cup, I was 22 years old. My first appointment was to take care of the Dominican stand in Cancun, and then I was trained along the process. 3 years after that, I became a stakeholder for the Inter-American Institute for Global Research, and I started to see science and diplomacy as a whole from a total different perspective, right? So in the Dominican Republic, what the government has been trying to do, even with me, being a woman, being the first woman and the youngest in the history of the convention to have this role, um, is to try to put the youth on the table. We have 4 programs, bilateral programs that we are implementing right now. One from the government and one university of the Dominican Republic that we put together in 2021, training our official delegates from 22 years old to 28 years old on negotiations with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have the Climate Reality Project from Al Gore that it's been tailoring training programs in negotiations with the realities of the Dominican Republic without biasing the process, even with their support, because of course you cannot train me in negotiations if you don't know my external policies, and diplomacy. And that comes from the president himself, and then from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then from the priorities of the Ministry of Environment. And the new program is the Climate Youth Negotiator Program that was put together by a group of young people that were part of the young NGOs that are stakeholders to the convention. But now they have agreements with the countries, and they are bringing official delegates. They are training them for 6 months, and then 4 days over here, and then sitting them at the negotiations table, and all with a party badge. Because at the end, if you're not a party, you're a stakeholder. It's always going to be another person that speak for yourself. So I have to say that both ministers of environment of the past 3 years of the Dominican Republic, the vice minister of climate change and sustainable development, were very keen to have youth people in the table, and also hiring the like young people, because then how we talk about just transition if we don't know the balance in between the gap from youth to old people. And when we were having this meeting, like an hour ago, we approached a minister that was passing by, and these people that I was having the meeting told them, oh, it will be great to have like a coalition of actual, official delegates from countries that has been advocating to have the young people in the table, with an approach that comes from their policy to include young people not only as labor and training them and developing capacity building, but also for them to be over here. And this person was like, no, like, um, what's the goal? And we were like, the goal is that you need the young people to take their future in their hands. And the process is complicated because at the end, it's um, like governments tend to be full of a lot of situations and egos and whatever. But what we've been trying to do in the 3 years that I was climate change director, and even engaging with the Inter-American Institute for Global Research, was to have that match in between science and diplomacy, and trying to put together and to put forward a way in which these delegates go to the negotiation table first with a backing, because they are official delegates of like they work for the Ministry of Environment. So each of them has a position, either convention and treaties analyst, or adaptation, vulnerability, like all the topics. And then you give them the topic not only that is passionate for them, but also the topic that they are working in the ground. So we, like, the Dominican Republic is trying to match like these three things. So enabling labor for young people, giving them the opportunity to go to the negotiations table, and also work on something that they feel they can fight for that, but not from an advocacy perspective, but science and the reality of the Dominican Republic. And from there, the country, what the country did is to use the national determined contribution, NDC, as like the policy guidance for them to go to the negotiations table. We don't want to call that a country position, but it's what we are using as a country position. But that has a reason, and it's because it's the only document that the Dominican Republic has presented to the convention that was validated by all the stakeholders in the country. So from academia, from private sector, from civil society, and the government, of course. And it's the only document that has language on youth, on children, on gender, and vulnerability in terms of climate change. So that's why we put together this, we say in Spanish, líneas discursivas. So it's like their speech, their lines that they use when they go to, to defend our positions and the groups that we are part of. And it's amazing that you just say that, because I was having a meeting about that just now, and being able like to outline that. And also, like, I've been advocating with the SAPSA chair to make people to understand what the process is, because then people come to us, you're the vice chair, here is some text. No, you cannot give me text. Like, I'm neutral. I literally, like, we have to facilitate the process. We have a legal team, but the only thing that can make a text possible is all the parties sitting together in what they discuss over there. And then we need to translate that with the legal team, with the SAPSA coordination support, and everybody involved. But we need to safeguard what the parties want, So, yeah, I'm going to leave it there. But I had to pop in because for me it's incredible that you were just talking about that. So, yeah, amazing.
Thank you, Natalie, Joshua. That was fascinating, because we're right at the edge of the science to policy process, and how non-state act, or not, the usual negotiators, the usual suspects, can participate and input that. And you're right, Natalie, it's incredibly complicated. I've seen that from the background as well, and it's not simple. It's easy to say, yes, youth should participate, but having that real participation is a challenge. Edwin, any words about this? Here, you can use mine. From an IGO perspective and a scientist perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's interesting to hear the discussion, because I think that what you were saying it's so true that the general public doesn't really understand what the process is, and I come to these COPs with different hats, and sometimes I come as a scientist, sometimes I come as a negotiator, and back home people tell me, so you go there and what do you do? Can you really make a difference? Can you really make something change? And I say, well, it depends. It depends because if I go as a scientist, I go to side events like this. We have a good discussion. We have good proposals, but we are really separated from the negotiation process. If I go as a negotiator, then I can present some text. Then I can argue what should be included or not included. But unfortunately, those two are parallel processes, and the fact is that the negotiation is always done among governments. And we expect that governments represent their people, but that's not necessarily true in all the cases. We were talking about young people. When I was listening to you, I was thinking, I think the same thing can be applied to indigenous groups, for example. Indigenous groups could claim, well, my government is not really representing me the way I wish they could, because they are not speaking for my own rights. And so it is a complex situation that is not a simple, doesn't have a simple solution, because we have to have a way to negotiate. And the way to negotiate is already set. It's going to be among the parties, it's going to be among the governments, and the only way that we can have additional people influencing the negotiation is, like you were saying, if these groups have a voice strong enough that the negotiators listen to them. Otherwise, they are not really present at the negotiation.
I'm sorry, I talk a lot, but you just said something important about indigenous people and the process. So, parties along the years, it's been 30 years of negotiation. So I was 5 years old when this started, right? So, um, I have been creating something that I sometimes call distractions, and the process is so slow usually that we start creating things around the party driving process to make it inclusive, which is good at certain extent. But then you have things that actually distract us, and by us I don't mean the chairmanship, but the countries of our mandate. And our mandate is to defend the most vulnerable people of the world, but the most important mandate is to reduce carbon emissions. And we're being distracted for 30 years on the ultimate goal of this convention, which is reducing carbon emissions. Is the convention reducing carbon emissions? Raise your hands if you think we are reducing carbon emissions. Okay, so I always put in perspective the Montreal Protocol, and I tell to people we saved the ozone layer with the Montreal Protocol. Why we cannot actually reduce carbon emissions? So sometimes, of course, I come from a mitigation background, as you can listen to me, but sometimes I get frustrated as a citizen, not even as an official or holding this role, and it's every time I see the numbers of the missions, I get frustrated because I'm like, okay, I'm part of this convention, I'm part of this governing body, but are we delivering what we have to do? So there are representations like the indigenous people and local communities that actually make the case through their governments to have their space. And now the convention has the local communities and indigenous people working group that works in session, deliver text, and pass it through the process that is created for them, and they have their representation, and that's amazing. But then you have other things like taking a decision on a fund or operationalization of a fund. Like each of these things delay your ultimate goal because you spend 2 years deciding which country is gonna be host of the fund, who's gonna be part of the board, where the funding is coming from, and it's creating job. But at the same time, like nobody is looking into the fact that in those 5 years of operationalization to compensate for something that it's damaged already, you are still not reducing carbon emissions. So that's another thing to put in perspective when we are trying to, you know, um, talk of the process and how like the international community look at the process, and it comes back again at a party driving process. And it's important, like, I mean, for me it's very important to highlight that, because then, like, even the president of the COP right now has a lot of pressure, but he is a party, and his country pays to be part of the United Nations as my country does. The United Nations is a club of governments, by the way. It's not other thing. It's a club of governments. It's something created for governments, and some people get lost into that. So the presidency of the COP bids to be the president, and parties make a global decision to accept that presidency. So they have the right to be president. And actually, they are the only presidency that puts on the table fossil fuel companies and puts on the table fossil fuel emitters and told them we need to deal with this because we haven't done it yet. You know, and I'm not defending that position, but I'm saying as much as my country is super vulnerable to climate change effect and I pay the fee of the convention, they do it too. So they have the right, you know, to do that. So what I want to say is that at the end, the awareness of the science and diplomacy perspective is needed to understand how we are going to achieve and overcome all these challenges that at this point we haven't been able to get, you know.
Thank you, Natalie. I have one more question that I was going to ask the panelists, but we have about 10 minutes left. And this has been a really fascinating conversation. And I was wondering if there's any questions from the floor before I ask the other question. Because we always say that we should have an interactive, voices should be heard. Well, this is your opportunity to have your voices heard. So any questions from the floor? Any comments that you'd like to make? Don't complain if you are not given an opportunity to speak. Clear? Yeah? Okay. My second question is, well, we've spoken a lot of the inegalities of the global south, the difficulty in equitable participation and so on. Natalie comes from a small island developing state in the Caribbean. Joshua is from Africa. Edwin comes from Central America, one of the Caribbean and Central America, one of the regions that will be most affected by climate change. I come from Brazil, a huge country, but it's a breadbasket. If southern Brazil goes under, imagine what that'll do to the food supply and so on and so on. And I spoke very much on the need to have an equitable fund for science based on the II model. Edwin, in your words, why is the II an anomaly? Why has it worked so well? And how can that model that the II is using to fund science be used for something to understand better, like SR, solar radiation modification, or aerosols, or CDR, something to that effect? How can we develop something along the IEI lines to be effective?
Well, two things. One is the II was created to promote science, but not any science, but science that is useful for decision makers. So there is a direct mandate for the II to make sure that the science is usable by governments, usable by decision makers. So together with funding science, we also have a strong program on science diplomacy to make sure that scientists work together with governments in solving, pushing issues, current issues. But the other part of the II that I think is useful and unique is that we fund research that has to be multinational. So every project that we fund has to have at least 3 countries participating. And by doing so, we are forcing the research teams to start looking for networks. And those networks will also help to integrate countries that otherwise may not be even thinking about participating. Guatemala is a good example. Guatemala is a small country with a small science development, But when we participate in the IAI, we can participate at the same level as countries like Mexico or the US. So in my specific example, every time I submit a proposal to the IAI, I could have Guatemalan researchers work next to researchers from Mexico and the United States, and that will allow our researchers to learn and to develop their skills in terms of not only carrying out the research but also producing the publications to spread the research. And so basically this networking is helping smaller countries in terms of scientific development to work next to more developed countries and to learn from them and to eventually create these networks where knowledge can be shared and where experience can be shared. So I think that's important, and I think that will enable smaller countries to participate more fully. One last thing I want to mention is that funding itself is not enough, because you can have the funding available, but if you don't have the researchers to make use of the funding, then you are still having the same problem. So together with the funding, you need to have the capacity building. You need to make sure that you have researchers with the minimum level of knowledge to be able to use the funding. So both things have to go hand in hand.
Joshua, I have $1 billion, and I go to you and I say, what does Africa need to understand climate impacts, SRM, aerosols, CDR, and so on and so on?
Well, I'll take it. Um, and for all the reasons I gave before, that's why we need the money. But I guess a couple of things I would say. A, I think that we need to systematically integrate this into our academic programs across the continent. I mean, you well know that South Africa is the only place on the continent where there's already existing research and equipment there for that, and this is not enough. So really building capacity, at least sub-regional, to have each sub-regional having a university that has the tools, equipment to be able to do such advanced research, but also like cloud computing and the different tools that are needed to really do this very high data level of work will be super critical. Then the second part, the second thing I'll mention is that we need to be able to provide basic income for researchers on the continent. It's a continent that have a lot of researchers who pursue research not getting paid. So it's, of course, it affects the longevity of the work they do and being able to pursue that and come up with a very good outcome that is good for policymakers. And I think based on because there's lack of confidence in the research work for young people and early career researchers, policymakers, the relationship between policymakers and researchers is very fragile. So you go to universities and rarely do you come across university, either professors or tutors or researchers who are involved in the policy-making processes across the continent. So the disconnect between academia and policy making is getting wider and wider, and we need to close that gap for all the reasons that Edward just said. So I think that would also require the financing that is required to allow universities to have the tools and resources to do that, but also to participate in policy conversations at home, but also abroad. And I think the last thing I'll mention is the growing brain drain that exists on the continent. So because of the lack of confidence, the lack of tools and equipment, everyone, a majority of researchers want to do their research abroad. What that is doing is that those researchers increase the attractiveness of foreign universities to even get more research funding. Because then it allowed the university abroad to say that, oh, we have a bunch of researchers from Africa on our team. It makes them more competitive to get research funding. Why can't those researchers be in their home country, apply for those funding with their home university, and get that money to their university at home to host that resources and do that? So really, it's a systematic problem, but we need to start from somewhere. And I think where we need to start from is allowing universities in the West and in the North to really build a very good and respectful collaboration with universities in the South, particularly for countries where the capacity is very low, to be able to move resources to those countries, for them to be the principal investigators, to be the lead researchers in the work, and move resources there for those work to be done, and pay people for the time that they use when doing research, because livelihood and income is fundamental for every of course growing young person, but also adults, and that is currently missing for many researchers. So I think the CRA fund, or the Climate Research for All Fund, will be very instrumental in doing this, as long as it's very accessible, and the accessibility also has a very good lens of equity, but also really triggering already famous and known high-profile universities to have the right collaboration with others in the South to be able to really allow them to lead some of the high-impact research that is happening. Yeah.
And Natalie, I have a question for you. And correct me if I'm wrong. My perception is that small, I keep coughing, but nobody worry, it's not COVID, it's not a cold or the flu, I have asthma. My perception is that small island developing states, I don't want to say are supportive or wish to, but are more open to the idea to discuss innovative technologies, including human intervention in the climate because of the challenges they face. Would that be correct? And if that's a correct assumption, again, I have $1 billion like I offered Josh, and yeah, no, you. What would a small island developing state first focus on?
I don't, I cannot talk for all small island developing states, but I think since we are the most affected by the issue and by the vulnerability that we have intrinsic, of course we need solutions and we need urgent solutions. Specifically, like I'm gonna talk about my country, of course, because it's first in the way of all hurricanes of, of the Atlantic. Second, even when we have like 6 months that are not hurricane season, we can have other issues that come from climate change outside the hurricane season that always affect us, and that comes from droughts or affecting like our food security or the tourism itself. Like my country live completely from tourism. Of course, we have other businesses that have been growing in the past, I don't know, 16 to 20 years, but mostly we live from tourism. So when we put our needs in perspective, it all starts with nature-based solutions because we live from tourism, and you cannot have tourism without nature. And we have an intrinsic need of protecting nature. At the same time, we are an island that is shared with another nation that turns out to be the poorest country in the Caribbean, in the Americas, and I don't want to say the world because I don't have the numbers right now, but it's a very complicated situation that also makes the whole adaptation, vulnerability, nature-based solution process even more difficult when it comes to the resources that we use every day, including water. We don't have a snowpack because we are in the middle of the tropics, right? But like other countries have the snowpack, and with the snowpack they have water. But we need the forest to have water, and at the same time we cannot compromise our food security. Like all the fishing of the Dominican Republic goes to Punta Cana. Like for me to eat seafood, it's like if it's something luxury, and I'm from an island, and it's because everything it's been collected to go to the east side of the country because we need to, provide for the tourism. So I think countries are open to technology transfer, capacity building, and all this language that we've been putting together in this space and the space of other conventions. But of course, if you don't have systematic research within the country, then you're tied up because how are you going to implement something that comes from technology that goes beyond of the capability that you have in the country? So we are facing, like in the past 10 years, I have 13 working for the government. So in the past 10 years, it's like, how are we going to ensure that we don't leave this in consultancy from other country and it goes beyond having as a result a PDF? which is also a challenge. So now the Ministry of Higher Education is trying to put funds in which like our students are doing the research. Like I have two students in my team working with the whale, with the ecosystem services of the Samana Bay that turns out to be my favorite part of the country. The whales come there to give birth, so these girls are, calculating like the cost of the ecosystem service when the whales come, and how we're going to fight erosion, how we're going to work with the tourism industry in the bay. And both the university, the government, and them as a professional are relating that to climate change, and they come to the negotiations as well. So it's not perfect, but we are sort of on the way. And I wanted to say something about something that you mentioned of the exchange with the universities and the global north and south. I lived in the US for 4 years, and at a state level, states do a lot. But for example, and 2 months ago, I was in UCLA. 3 months ago, I was in Columbia. And of course, these are Ivy League and big universities. And I have a lot of friends in Yale, and they are aware of the process. And then we put together a negotiation program, short course with Harvard. But then I was like, where are the Americans? Like, you have Al Gore, that is a former vice president of the US, funding a program for the global south, and then you don't have the same opportunity for the kids of the United States to be accredited by their government to come over here, trained by the Climate Reality Project, that actually it's an initiative that come from the US. So I went to Yale, I went to UCLA, I went to Columbia, and I told them, like, we have to put together something that American kids, like, say, I want to be part of this process, because then like you have Kerry over here, which I had the honor like to negotiate the Paris Agreement with. Like we were sitting together uh, day and night in Paris, but at the end, like, where is the fuel, for the same thing that you are doing for the global south, if you don't have the funders, like the emitters, the polluters, even in Europe. Like I was telling in another space, like my boyfriend is from a developed country, and he had to move to the Dominican Republic to work for a government. So those are the things that we also need to put in perspective, because this is very well trained people, and they are not being recognized in science and diplomacy to be part of the process.
Thank you, Natalie. Unfortunately, we don't have any time left for questions, but we'll remain here if you want to speak to us. I believe this is the first panel entirely from the Global South discussing SRM and funding for that. So I think perhaps it gives a different perspective and a greater voice. And I'm very glad that we have a very diverse audience as well. So these words, Natalie, thank you very much. I know you're super busy with SBSTA and the negotiations and so on. The fact that you got lost coming here trying to find us is much, much appreciated. Josh, thank you. Edwin, thank you very much for coming with all your business. And thank you to all of you.